Okay, welcome back to the Modern Revolution. This is Pete Deely. I'm glad you decided to come back and listen again. Get so fortunate here, get to talk to interesting people, and unexpectedly they come into our lives, and I get a chance to have conversations that I might not ordinarily have. And as you know, if you've listened in the past, we don't spend time telling you why you should listen to the guests. We instead encourage you to listen. And then, should you want to know more about them, we'll give you the places that you can learn more about them. And today we have Mr. Logan Hufford. Logan, thanks for making time for us.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So we start this generally with the same question, Logan. We like to ask, what problem are you trying to solve in the world?
Well, the last couple words you add to that question really makes it a big scope in the world. Initially, it wasn't in the world. I was trying to solve a problem for myself,
Nice.
for my life. For years, I was trapped in a cycle of sexual addiction and cheating and affairs and pornography, and I didn't think there was any hope for a different life. After a lot of years of that destructive behavior and hurting others, including my wife, um, God put people in my path and gave me a way out. And it's not been easy, but
Mhm.
it's a different life and it's an incredible life. And so the last 8 years have been, my mission has been to working in recovery, working with guys and just trying to show that there is a different way. There's a better way.
It was interesting. I mean, in that description, if someone's listening and they may not be familiar with the consequences of addiction, like they may think about it in theory, but they don't know about it in the actual consequences. And so when they hear this, clearly the destructive nature of cheating is something most adults have an opinion about. Either they've had the experience or they're aware of it out there in the world. And the general idea of addiction being something that hurts a life is something that people are familiar with. But most people would associate the notion of being sexual as a positive thing. And so if we take that part of this, um, maybe you could talk about, like, if you were to compare this to, say, an addiction to a drug like heroin, where or crack, or pick your drug, whatever's in your imagination listening, uh, where the consequences of those things manifest themselves very obviously. However, somebody who's in a life in which, sexuality is so, whatever you want to say, present, as a part of, like, whatever, not everybody would say that's such a that's not the same level of addiction, but it may be that they misunderstand that. So could you talk a little bit about, sexual addiction relative to
Mm.
other types of addictions?
Absolutely. And part of when I share my testimony, a lot of times I reference the fact that in 2015, which was it wasn't when I got sober, it wasn't when I started
Mhm.
healthy living, but it was the first time I ever went to a meeting. It was the first time I actually literally took a test that my wife asked me to take after years of affairs. She said, "Take this test," and it was literally a test. Are you a sex addict?
Okay.
And I remember like, what does that even mean? Sex addict? Like that's a was that some gross dude in his basement, or it's a
Yeah,
sexual
yeah.
predator, it's somebody on a
Okay.
list somewhere.
Right,
That's in my head, that's what a sex addict was.
right.
And it ultimately sexual addiction is I have compulsive and impulsive behavior that no, number one, for anyone that's not deeply familiar with addiction, uh, I am responsible for my choices. I chose my choices.
Right.
But there's also this idea of like powerless to stop. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. So
Okay.
I'm powerless to stop urges from being felt.
Okay.
And that's the tricky part. But it's sexual addiction is I've had compulsive sexual behaviors that I had trained myself to chase after, just like a drug.
Okay.
Um, and It's not an addiction to sexual activity necessarily.
Okay.
It is an addiction to, for me, it was a progressively uh, harder to liken it to a drug,
Right.
progressively harder uh, sexual highs.
Mhm.
And so it went all the way from pornography to sexual affairs,
Right.
hiring prostitutes. It wasn't about the physical act of sex.
Okay.
Uh, it was not about, oh, I'm not getting enough sex, and so I need to get more, so I'm going to hire a prostitute. It
Right.
wasn't about, oh, I just love this so much, I need more of it.
Okay.
I had developed a, just like Pavlov's dog, I had trained myself. I like the feeling that I get when I chase after this thing.
Right.
Um, Especially if it was, in an interaction with another woman,
Right.
in real life, the high that came from that interaction, that relationship. So it there's different manifestations, but you know, the man who ended up mentoring me when I got serious about recovery, he had an addiction to pornography. He
Mhm.
never had a sexual interaction with any woman outside of his marriage.
Okay.
And yet I was absolutely able to learn from him and be mentored by him because deep down, manifested it flowered differently in our lives.
Right.
We had a lot of common denominators.
Mhm.
We had the same, you know, perverted drives basically of that, God created me to be this way. And unfortunately, I went way off the rails and I started chasing things off the path.
So, I mean, there's this I'm just curious about the aspect as that happened, as that manifested itself between you and other people, because now you're meaningfully younger than I am. And so Henry Kissinger may not hold any place in your imagination. But he's a statesman from back when, and he has this famous quote, famous to a certain age, right, where everything in the world, all the interactions in the world are sexual in some way, shape, or form. Except for sex, which is about power. So he has this quote about like, all the power plays in the world are actually sexual in some way, shape, or form, but then sex becomes about power. So in the parts of this, addiction that involved you and other people, was the chase the addiction or was the whatever the right term is, I don't have good language, so I think of like,
Sure.
was there like a conquest idea type of thing? Like, was it the catching of the person into an experience that was primary? If it wasn't the sexual act itself, was it the chase? Was it the like achievement? What was fueling that I want to do this again?
Yeah, that was a huge part of it was the chase.
Right.
And some of my verbiage might come across as callous or minimizing. I definitely don't intend it to be that way. I
Right.
and there's also part of me that I might speak in almost clinical or sterile terms.
Right.
And part of that is that I what I don't want to do is glorify it.
Sure.
Because that's all I did in that lifestyle was
Yeah.
glorify how fun this is or how
Right.
cool
Right.
I am or whatever. But yeah, the chase of it was huge.
Okay.
And and that's not to say that again, yeah, on a deep down base level that I didn't enjoy sex or that I didn't enjoy the feeling I mean, yes, I enjoyed the biological feeling that that gave me,
Sure.
but it was the thrill of the chase, to use that phrase. That is what gave me the biggest high. I mean,
Okay.
to give you an example without getting graphic, when I would have an affair, I got more high
Mhm.
from a text back that might say a certain something or give me okay, there's a little bit of that attention. I'm getting what I'm wanting. That
Right.
gave me more of a high in some ways
Right.
than the actual physical interaction.
Okay. So, I mean, so there's this part of you that is, enjoying the process of all of the things that later on you consider counter to your best interest, and there's all of these pleasures that are associated with it. So, when you decided to make a change, did it come to you via an epiphany, like all at once, where you're like, "This is I can't be like this anymore," or was it incremental? Was there, like, one thing after another that happened that finally led you to, "Okay, that's all. I gotta live differently."
So I progressively hated myself
Okay.
more and more and more over the course of years.
Right.
I know, it's not like I've shared my full autobiography, obviously, for time purposes here.
Yeah,
But I
right.
mean, I went from, pornography to flirting to then cheating and having
Mhm.
extramarital sexual affairs. They started before we got married. They started when my wife and I were not even married yet. Was the
Right.
first time I cheated on anyone. Um, and I never felt good about it. There was never a point in my life where I'm like, oh, this is fine. I knew it was
Okay.
terrible. I knew I was
Right.
being a terrible person and I was hurting her and all this. We had kids young. We got
Mhm.
married young. We had kids young. So I mean, coming home at night trying to read and put my kids to bed, all the while knowing what I was doing 2 hours ago and what I'm doing the
Yeah,
next
right.
morning.
Yeah.
So I hated myself. That part just got progressively darker and darker. And there wasn't so much an epiphany moment. There was, I mean, epiphany is not a word I've ever associated with this moment. There was a moment though, and
Okay.
there's a moment of hope.
Okay.
I always liken it to I was in this cave that again, I put myself there and I own
Mhm.
that. But I was in this cave that like, okay, I got myself here, but I legitimately don't know how to get out. I have gotten to the point where porn is just a constant thing I'm doing. Flirting is a constant thing I'm doing. I'm preying on every female I interact with to see what I can get out of the interaction. And that's just what I do. And I literally had gotten to the point where I'm like, I don't know how to do anything different. I'm just going to keep hurting my wife and hurting everyone around me. So the epiphany or the hope moment was it was well, I'll back up just briefly. So in
Sure.
2015, at that point we're 4 years into marriage and literally more affairs than I could count. And my wife knew about these things. I'd confessed these things to her because each time I legitimately thought I was done, which is
Mhm.
insane, but I thought I was not going to do it again.
Okay.
And so she knew about these things. And finally, she did something she had never done before. She gave me an ultimatum. And my wife is a very strong woman who she does not just say things rashly. And she's like, Logan, if you do not help and make serious change, I will take the boys. She was pregnant with our fourth. We had three boys already. She
Right.
said, I'll take the boys and I'm gone. And that scared me because she'd never said anything like that. And so I started going to some meetings. I took that test I referenced earlier. I did some things. I didn't really institute any different infrastructure in my life other than started attending some meetings. But it was about a year of a journey of attending different meetings and doing something, but really, half-heartedly doing them. And then in March 2016, um, I had met a guy at a Celebrate Recovery, which is a Christ-based 12-step recovery group. Um, and he brought me to a different meeting because the Celebrate Recovery, he was like, hey, I'm glad you're here. I think you need something that's a little bit more hardcore, a little bit more intense. And it's like, there's a group called Prodigals in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm saying Alaska for your audience, but we're up in Wasilla, Alaska, which is an hour north of Anchorage. So come to Anchorage with me sometime. I'd love to take you to this group. I think you might need it.
Okay.
And so I went to that group in March of 2016, and I never envisioned that what this group was. I never envisioned it was possible. So I'm sitting down, and after I got a chance to meet some guys, there's a group of maybe like 20 guys. About half of those guys had had basically my story, some variations, but basically my story, that kind of depravity, that kind of progressive sexual
Right.
addiction, and yet had years of healthy living, not
Okay.
just sobriety, actual healthy living. Most of them had restored marriages, not every single one,
Sure.
because that obviously takes two, right? But and I'm like, I didn't think that was possible. I literally had not fathomed that, and so that's what I mean. God gave me hope in that moment that, okay, I don't know what these guys had to do that, but I think I'm willing to try.
So you were living in Wasilla during all of this time, is that right? Or
Most of it, yeah. I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and my wife and I got married in Anchorage, and we moved out to Wasilla, which is an hour north of Anchorage,
okay.
shortly after getting.
So, I mean, I bring that up because I was born in New York and I've lived primarily in big cities. So I don't think of Anchorage as being a very giant community.
Right.
So it kind of seems like a lot of time management and ability to get somebody to keep a secret to live this lifestyle in such a small community. Like it must have, I mean, there must have been a lot of pressure to conduct yourself in that way in a place that see but to my way of thinking at least, like, the degree of separation between your wife and the people that you were involved in couldn't have been that far. I mean, it must have compounded the problem in a certain sense. If you're in Manhattan, you got a few million people,
Right.
your ability to keep something discreet is higher, I would think, than Anchorage or anyplace else.
I mean, it's interesting you say that. I've honestly I've never thought about it that way, just in terms of comparing it to other cities. Part of that's just it's all relative. I only know what I know.
Sure.
Um, I've always known that I've traveled and been to other places. Like I realized Anchorage is not a big city. Alaska. But yeah, at the same time, it's like when you live in Wasilla, yeah, Anchorage is the big city because Anchorage is a quarter million people. Wasilla is
Right.
forty
Right.
thousand or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but it's all relative. But to that point, yeah, I was extremely careful to
Right.
hide my tracks. I was extremely careful to do things a certain way. I mean, we talk about all the time in recovery. I if I put the effort
I mean, that's what I was
in
gonna, like,
any other
compare it
area
to.
of life I
Right,
put
yeah.
into my addiction, I
Sure.
mean, I would have killed it. But
Yeah, right.
it was so. I mean, I put so much effort and energy into making
Yeah.
sure that I wasn't going to get caught. Um, yeah,
Yeah, because it's a long like, what I'm hearing is it's a long time of this behavior in a way that, like, the world you might have cured cancer. I mean, it's, all of that energy and thought that went into that. There's a there's a documentary about a punk rock singer in LA called Rob Monster, and he was this punk star, and he was, like, as talented a musician as that community had in LA, but he was an alcoholic, and his alcoholism undercut his ability to capitalize on his talent, and it ruined what would have otherwise been a spectacular career. He had a good career, but it, like, really been something extraordinary.
yeah,
And so he becomes later in his life an addiction counselor, and he has a lot of authority with the people he works with because he was like, as like a epic partier, and his alcoholism was on display. And he has this quote in the movie that really stayed with me. He's like, "You have this crappy life. You're ruining all your relationships as an alcoholic, and you're, destroying all your business situations, and you are fighting hard to have this life. Like you are really fighting hard to have this terrible situation." So I just think about like uh all of the different things that you must have had to gone through you must have been through to kind of protect this addiction and all the rest of it. I mean, it begs the question, um, how does your wife accommodate this in her psychology, in her, relationship to you, and probably her relationship to herself? Because I would if I'm her, I'm thinking, "What am I doing? Like, why do I tolerate this um, compromise of my what I thought I was getting into when I got married or had this relationship?" I mean, that just seems like a pretty complicated thing for her. Could you talk a little bit about that?
absolutely. I mean, truthfully, I so sometimes we share our testimony together, and
Right,
at some point, I'd love to do podcasts with her. That's something that's on the table in the future.
right.
Um, because yeah, when I share my story, when I talk to somebody about it, I'm thankful to share it. But it does. It feels like it's half of it because it is, and
Yeah,
until she
yeah,
shares her piece.
right.
So I mentioned she gave me an ultimatum in 2015, and that was the first time she ever said that. And and everything I'm sharing from her perspective, she has shared this, that she's shared
Sure.
with people, and I've heard her. So I mean, I can. It's not just assumptions, and it is
Right, right, right.
so during from the time that I first confessed, which was 1 year after we got married, that was the first time I wrote a letter and I shared all it. And ultimately, what I've learned now is I vomited. I
Yeah,
vomited
yeah,
all this
yeah,
stuff
yeah.
to make me feel better.
Right.
From that moment on, she would tell you now, she was really intentional to do all the things that women are commonly advised to do in this situation. Now, nobody actually advised her. She
Okay.
just was like, okay, I need to be sexier. I need to be more sexually available. I
Right.
need to make sure to, not get fat, and I need to be a better wife, and I need to, be a better mom, and just
Sure.
all these things so that my husband will love me more and find me more attractive and won't have to cheat on me.
Right.
And she might not have said all those things out loud, but she would tell you now she did those things.
Right.
And when, so then she gives me this ultimatum, and I enter recovery. She enters recovery. She entered recovery 2 months after I did. There's a group. So my mentor's wife, Patty, she was leading a group called Partners in Process. And what they do is it's specifically for women who have been abused by sexual betrayal trauma, or have have suffered sexual betrayal trauma, because that's a huge other piece to this.
Right.
And so she got into recovery in July of 2016, and she's never stopped going either. I mean, this is our life's work. Me working with men, and her like working with women. And when we share our story, I've heard this from folks. She's heard this from folks. And it's honestly, it's an accidental thing that can be really hurtful sometimes. Is people will say something to the effect of like, "It's so wonderful you stayed with Logan." And I know where they're coming from. She
Sure.
she takes it in stride. They're trying to be encouraging and loving, right? But it's like the wonderful thing isn't that she stayed with her husband. The wonderful thing is that she actually had the strength and courage to stand up to her abuser and
Hmm.
say, I can't control if you hurt me, but if
Right.
you continue to hurt me, I will be gone. That's the wonderful piece of it.
Right.
And I'm thankful that she had compassion. Well, I shouldn't say compassion. I'm thankful that she had the grace, to
Hmm.
be willing to be like, okay, if you're going to be serious, then okay, we will work on this, but only if you're going to be serious. And I'm very thankful that I have my wife in my life. But
Yeah.
it was only on the condition that there's believable change,
Yeah.
not just promises.
Yeah. George Harrison, the Beatle, George Harrison was a famous,
Mhm.
philanderer of his wife. And they asked his wife one time, like, well, why, how does this marriage continue? Like, what's going on? And she's like, well, we just don't get divorced. And she wasn't saying like she was capitulating to it, but she was saying that they just continue to figure things out as they go. And they both chose that. And there's that famous psychologist has her own podcast, has a very famous like TED talk. This woman, Esther Perel, who you may be familiar with. And, she talks about um, how is infidelity the end of a particular relationship? And so, meaning a marriage. And the structure of the family and the structure of the couple, in my mind, although, they have um, are two different things for me. Like a familial structure, I mean, your relationship to your children is I have a blended family of 5 children, and my relationship to my children is my own. And it does sit within the context of, familial structure. But so when you bring children into the picture, I think um, it is a complicating variable because then you have to think a little bit about like, well, I mean, how do I want to create an environment for my kids, and then what sacrifices do I make? When you think about all of the energy that goes into your counseling and mentoring of the addicts, does it feel like a replacement to the energy and of being addicted to sex, as like just switch that energy in this direction? And so you're have, for lack of a better term, an addiction to this work? Or does it feel like that part of that is the addict is essentially at bay, and now you approach this work as something different than an addict? So, that begs the question, are you are you addicted to something new, or you healed from addiction and presenting yourself as somebody like, I understand that, and that's not who I am. And so I'm helping you from the space of an unaddict.
Yeah. So there's like three different branches from that tree that I want to go on, but
Okay.
um, it, the short answer is no. I can confidently say no. It's definitely not a new addiction. However, my mentor always calls it switching horses.
Right. Right.
A new addiction is absolutely a real thing, and there have been different addictions. Not necessarily nothing's replaced the sexual addiction in terms of the destruction, the time,
Yes. Right. Right. Right.
nothing came close. But I definitely sometimes this can sound like a cop out to say I have addictive personality, but whatever you would call that, yeah,
Sure.
I definitely have tendencies. I go all in on something. I tend to do that,
Right.
and I mean, not to like get super into the weeds, but I mean, I have to be careful with games on my phone.
Yeah.
I can just really lock in and spend way too much time on that.
Right.
Uh, so I have to be careful with it. I mean, I love me some pinochle. I get pinochle. Um, but I mean, literally, because
Yeah.
it became a problem. Um, so I do have to be careful about the switching horses thing, but it's definitely. I mean, in terms of like time or energy spent, I suppose maybe the math might check out there. I've never thought about that, to be honest.
Hmm.
With the third piece is, you didn't pose it as a question, but like the idea of am I healed or is this a new addiction? I don't use the word healed past
Okay.
tense.
Okay.
But I
Hey.
also don't say so for 7.5 years, I have said, I'm Logan and I'm a recovering sex addict at the
Right.
start of a
Right.
meeting.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that verbiage. Some people don't like that verbiage because they feel like your identity is, and I get that.
Right.
But I do say something different. I say, I'm Logan and I'm no longer in bondage to sexual addiction.
Okay.
And to me, that it's a kind of a small difference, but it's a big difference
Yeah, I get it.
because I'm no longer in bondage. That's a fact. However, I could still go back if I wanted to, if I chose to, if I
Right.
chose to let my guard down, if I chose to let it in, I could go back, but I'm not going
Right.
to.
I mean, I have an opinion about you can't achieve things of excellence without a certain obsessive behavior. You can't Steve Jobs did not make Apple because he had work-life balance.
Right.
It was not that's not how that came about.
Michael Jordan.
Michael Jordan did not become Michael Jordan by like, going easy. He, make
Yep.
sure he took care of his skin with he wasn't trading his time for anything other than to become excellent at this particular thing.
Right.
And it produces in society extraordinary things. Um, so I find it a hard, and I look in my own family, I look at like addiction in my own family. And generally what I've seen is the switching horses, usually to like health. And so all of a sudden, things are organized around being as healthy as possible. And we take that, like, that's fine. Like,
Right.
we would rather be
You go down a
listening to
horse. That's not the worst one.
that's not the worst one. We'd rather be hearing about the virtues of organ meat and and why you need, whatever, you need to work out as much as you need to work out. Um, and I find that tricky as a conversation. Like, if you wanna be really good at something, you gotta spend a lot of time at it. You gotta have
Yeah.
focus on it. So, I would imagine it would be tricky for anybody, and I'm gonna make an assumption for you as well. And I also so it becomes something that you don't wanna extinguish, your ability to focus, excellent at something, excellent at helping people.
Well, and a big difference, and like I said, I'm not going to pretend that I've spent hours considering that. I honestly had never thought about is recovery the same amount of time and energy. But one big difference, just as we're talking about it, is, and there's lots of differences, but one giant one is my sexual addiction, the behaviors that I chased after. I was impulsively and compulsively chasing something to get a high because that helped me cope with life.
Yes, right.
And there's nothing in my life that I do that now.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
because my life is easy or perfect. Now, I'll
Right,
be
right.
honest, life is easier now
Sure.
because I'm no longer dragging this like giant dead body that is my addiction around with.
Yeah.
But it is not easy. Raising kids is not. There's nothing about life that's easy.
Mhm.
Um, and yet, what recovery has done for me is it allowed me to interact with life in a healthy way,
Yeah.
which might sound kind of maybe sort of vague, right? But it's it just it that's the simplest way to put it. Is I'm not
Yeah.
perfect, but I can do things in a healthy way, Jen.
Yeah. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about this as it relates to and so, I have a large objection to the way that we're feeding, the world. We're feeding particularly a lot of people in this country, and it sets up a dynamic of it has a chemical dynamic of addiction in that so much of the food people are eating is designed really as a drug and not as a food. We have very small instances of people being addicted to lettuce. There's not a lot of carrot addiction being reported out there. But, you look at soda and all of the things that really are designed to be consumed with the notion that you'll consume it again and as quickly as possible. And that they're being made in factories, right? I mean, Doritos are not grown in the field. They are made in a factory and they're designed to make you addicted to Doritos. Um, and so, my wife's a naturopathic physician and, involved in various things that um, involve trying to get people healthier. And the switching horses is a way that talk to lots of folks that rather than give something up, you crowd out the bad thing. So, okay, if you go take a look at what 1,000 calories of vegetable and protein looks like, and then go take a look at 1,000 calories of soda, and you can get through 1,000 calories in a giant cup, or you could sit down and be a complete full. So when I think about how the part of you that is driven and part of you that is passionate and interested in being the best at something, that is a good quality. And so where you point that is going to be either a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle, is what my opinion is. But I think I don't know that we want to take that out of you like society because it's producing amazing results. You're probably helping many, many, many people. Um, when you observe other people in the world that might be on the road that you were on, what makes it difficult for the person who's on that road to recognize it as as serious a problem as it in fact is?
So where my mind goes with that question is specifically porn.
Right,
Now, I, I was gonna say I'm sure. I know there are people that feel differently about affairs than I do,
right,
and I mean, for me to have a conversation with anyone about this, there kind of has to be a baseline of like, do we agree that if I'm married, I shouldn't have another
right,
sexual
right,
relationship? We
right,
kind of
right.
have to have that baseline, otherwise,
Yeah,
there's not really a point
yeah.
in
What's to
conversation.
talk about then? Right.
Um, but that's generally not minimized nearly as much as I would say porn is minimized.
Yeah,
Um,
that's interesting.
and so, porn is totally not the only manifestation. It's not the final manifestation.
Sure.
But it is probably the one I would say the juxtaposition of how dangerous it is versus how it's seen in society
Yeah.
is pretty off kilter there. So, I mean, there's for anyone, I like I said, I don't have a book or course or something that I'm here to try to
Right.
sell, right? But if anyone is interested in resources, the Conquer series
Okay.
is Ted Roberts uh, put that on, and I've seen it on DVD, but I'm sure nowadays 2024, I'm sure you just
Right.
digitally. But it goes into the science of addiction, specifically sexual addiction, and it's pretty crazy. It's pretty scary
Right.
right, how sexual addiction works. Um, to put it simply, though, so the high that I get from masturbating to pornography,
Hmm.
I get a stronger high, a stronger dose of the drugs that are out of my body
Right.
than I do from cocaine.
How interesting.
Um, it's so I mean, there's different ways to measure how addictive something is. There's different ways
Okay.
to measure, but depending on how you're measuring it, pornography is absolutely as addictive and as dangerous as any hard drug out there.
Yeah,
Um,
I that's a fascinating, like, it's a fascinating idea, and I have an opinion about that as well, in that it feels to me now, I'm 53, so, yeah, middle age at best, and depending on where you are in the spectrum, old, and, and that, so wherever you wanna, I'm not a young person anymore. And so when I observe who I consider to be young people, which basically is, it's, well, the line gets later and later the older that I get. But let's
right.
say up until 30, so in your 20s and below. What I feel like I'm observing out there is a lack of interest in um, sexuality between people, and a diminished interest in, like, for example, with my kids, there were some of my kids who, like, ready to drive day one, and then others of them are like, "I'll get to it when I get to it," and I've seen their friends go a year without getting their license, which, when I was a 16-year-old, there was nobody who did not wanna drive as soon as possible. So I was looking at some statistic that was talking about, uh, young men, as a what percentage of young men, like 27 and below, self-reported being virgins? And the number seems to be higher, like meaningfully higher than even 15 years ago. And the only thing that I attribute that to, because the human urges have not changed since human beings became human. So I don't think there's a lack of interest in that. But that energy, I think, is so available to them on their phones that they can have the safety of not having to go risk relationships, but then get that drug of, release, um, that then tides them over to where it's like, well, so much effort to go figure out how to get, a partner.
It
Um,
is.
so I don't know that I'm right about it, but I have an opinion that that's why that trend is growing.
I 100% believe that. And yeah, I've seen some of those same statistics and read some articles regarding that. And I agree. I think it's the only thing that makes sense. Porn use is not going away. It's not getting less. So as things just get more and more accessible. I mean, when I started, I mean, I grew up in a relatively conservative household, that kind of thing, but still, it was J.C. Penney catalog and dial-up internet when
Yeah,
parents were
right.
asleep.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't on a phone. It wasn't.
Right. Right.
I
Yeah.
had to work hard, but and I mentioned power control earlier,
Sure.
like the high of illusion of power, the high that gave me when
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
get the
Yeah.
text back, when I get the attention. Well, you don't get more power and control than I'm going to pick the type of woman that I
Yeah.
see,
Right.
the type of hair, what's going to be happening on that. I mean, and again, not to be graphic, but I mean, I control exactly what I'm looking at. I don't
Yeah.
like that. I'll skip to the next one. I'll go find a
Right.
different website.
Yeah.
It, and so it trains me to be this little kid that goes,
Yeah.
I want a new piece of candy, I want a new toy, except
Right.
it's so much more destructive than that. But
Yeah.
that's what I am. I was a man child that was just, you know, scrolling through stuff until I found what I wanted for that moment. And then, of course it graduated for me to basically playing that out in real life,
Yeah.
with affair after affair after affair.
Yeah, Chris Rock's famously, has had an addiction to pornography, and has a joke, and when I believe he gets divorced, and, he comes out, and that it was widely known that he had a pornography addiction, and he comes out with one of his, comedy specials, and, of course, has to get that elephant out of the room, and he's like, "Look, in the beginning, I was like, 'Oh my goodness, there's breasts in front of me,' and then it progressed to, 'I need a Spanish woman with, a black backside,' and like, he goes through it's meant to be comedy, but he describes something very similar, like, the further along he went, the more control and, of the variables of all of that to kinda satisfy, um his needs. So as it relates to, obviously, Chris Rock's got all the resources in the world, probably all the attention a person could possibly want, and still, it was something that played out in a destructive way in his life, as well. So yeah, it's I appreciate. I mean, it's brave you come and talk about it. It's brave that you faced your addiction earlier in your life, and and I'm glad that you're doing the good work in the world because I think there could have been an impulse to say that's over. Let's just put it away. Let me just move on. And in a certain sense, wouldn't honor all the effort that you took to get your life in the direction that it was. So, anyway, so thank you for doing that. Thanks for telling your stories. And if someone's listening, maybe they just even want to connect with your social media or something like that. Do you have an Instagram or something that someone could, pay attention to you as you go along in case you got a place where you're sharing any sort of inspiration?
So I, the short answer is no, I don't. That maybe I did things out of order, and there's sometimes I think I did. I would like, and my wife also, if we were on the same page here, is having a social media specifically recovery minded, because right now we have
Yeah,
a personal social media,
sure.
and we don't shy away from recovery, but it's also not that's not the focus of it.
Right.
Um, so the short answer is no. If somebody wants to contact, if they have a question though, if
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
struggling, whatever that looks like, we have an anonymous email that goes to myself and my wife Carrie. And so
Okay.
if a man has questions, if a spouse has questions,
Right.
if you want to put that in the show notes, I would love to put it
Sure.
there, and
Yeah.
people can definitely reach out that way.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Well, thank you. And I think it'll be fascinating for the world to see the two of you together because I think I'm thinking of my own reaction to you. Like I'm so curious as to what Carrie would be saying if she's next to you. And if you guys do that together, I think it would be something valuable because it's too easy to make assumptions about what she may have been thinking. And to her perspective, often we hear the perspective of the addict's journey, like, well, I did this and then I did that and so on and so forth. But everybody surrounding that addict that was affected by that addiction generally is not in the conversation. So it's a unique situation in my mind that this was something that became apparent. You guys worked through. It wasn't incidental. It was, it was really big. It's one thing for somebody. We have lots of stories of people getting over a particular affair, but then this is something altogether different. Um, anyway, so thank you very much. I appreciate you sharing your story, and perhaps there'll be a time when you come back with your wife. We'll do this again.
Would love to.
All
Thank you
right.
so much, Pete.
Yeah, Logan. Well, listen, guys, here's another modern revolutionary, and it took a lot of courage to come out to talk to us, and all the work he's doing takes a lot of grit because you could kind of give up in the face of being uncomfortable, but he didn't. I hope that it was something that you learned from, and I hope that it inspired you in some ways because I want to go out there and bring your passions to the world, your good work, because the modern revolution needs us all.